Chapter 3. An Exciting Plane Ride. "That's our Zip!" cried Pete, as he knelt beside the collie who lay on a rag rug near the stove. "Don't try to get up, boy." The other children crowded around their pet as Zip barked weakly and struggled to rise, his tail wagging feebly. But his left hind leg seemed to be hurt badly, and he sank back onto the rug. "Oh, you poor thing," Pam petted him sympathetically. Mr. Hollister stooped to examine the leg. "Zip must have been struck by something heavy," he stated. "I don't believe his leg is broken, but he'll probably be lame for a while." "I'm so glad it's no worse," said Pam. Then, turning to Mrs. Parker, she added, "Thank you so much for taking care of him." "I'm as happy about it as you are," the kind woman replied. Officer Cal questioned Mrs. Parker about any suspicious-looking people she might have seen in the neighborhood. Mrs. Parker said that she had seen 2 men sneaking through the field behind the church the afternoon before. One of them was carrying a canvas-wrapped bundle. "I'll bet the stolen poodle was in it," cried Ricky. "You're probably right," the policeman agreed, and explained to the woman what Ricky meant. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said. "It's too bad I didn't notice where the men went." Pete and his father had already lifted Zip up and were starting for the door. Ricky raced ahead and opened the station wagon. Zip was laid on the rear seat. Pam climbed in and put the dog's head on her lap. Then Mr. Hollister and the others crowded into the front. They said goodbye to Officer Cal and waved to Mrs. Parker, calling out, thank you very much." When the Hollisters reached home, Sue raced out and hugged the injured pet. "Oh, Zip," she said, "don't you ever chase a robber man again." Mr. Hollister and Pete again lifted Zip up and carried him to the kitchen, putting him down on the clean, soft blanket in his basket. His tail beat a happy rhythm. "He's showing us how pleased he is to be home," Pam said, as the children danced about the room. "I'll call the veterinarian and have him look at Zip," Mr. Hollister said, going to the phone. A little later, Dr. Wesley came and agreed with Mr. Hollister's diagnosis. Zip's injury was not a break in the bone, but a severe bruise. "Someone or something certainly gave him a mean wallop," observed Dr. Wesley. "But you're lucky he wasn't stolen, too. They haven't found a trace of that valuable poodle or of the man who stole him." Zip seemed much better already, although he was still content to lie upon his blanket most of the time. Knowing he would be all right, Pete said to his father, "How about our Florida trip? Now we can go." "I'll see if I can get reservations for tomorrow," Mr. Hollister replied. Then he went downtown, and when he returned home that evening, he said he had good news for his family. "The reservations are all set. We leave for the land of sunshine tomorrow afternoon." "In just 2 more days I'll be swimming," Ricky cried. "Be patient, Tadpole," his mother laughed. "There's lots to be done first. For one thing, we must arrange for all our pets to be taken care of." "I'll bet Indy will keep Zip at his house," Ricky suggested. "Our dog and his are good friends, so Zip won't get lonely." "I think Indy would be glad to do that," Mr. Hollister agreed. "And I'll ask him to come here to feed our little donkey and the cat and her kittens." "Maybe Dave Mead would come over every afternoon and exercise Domingo," said Pete. "The donkey needs a good run every day or he'll get lazy." The boy went off to telephone his friend and found that Dave would be glad to do this. Indy, too, said he would take care of the other pets. The Indian also offered to drive the Hollisters to the airport. Sunday morning found the whole family up early to prepare for their trip. After church and a hurried dinner, last-minute items were packed and the suitcases squeezed shut. Indy arrived at the appointed time to take the excited children and their parents to the airport. "I'll pick Zip up on my way back," the Indian said. "And don't worry, I'll take very good care of him for you." "Are you going to be a nurseman for him?" Sue asked. Indy laughed with the others. "Yes, I'll nurse him back to good health while you're away." When they reached the airport, the 5 children hurried into the administration building. They felt like old seasoned travelers, since they had been in planes several times before. After the baggage had been weighed and tickets secured, the Hollisters went out to wait for the plane. Soon the great airliner came down on its scheduled stop at Shoreham. The children scampered up the landing steps and into the plane, suddenly stopping short. The pretty dark-haired stewardess laughed and exclaimed, "The happy Hollisters again! Welcome to Flight 702. Do you remember me?" "Why, you're Miss Gilpin," Pam squealed in delight. "I thought you just flew on planes that went out west." "I was transferred last week," the young woman said, "just in time to take you all to Florida." The Hollisters sat down, with the 3 younger children at the windows. Mr. Hollister saw to it that all of them were safely belted in. The plane motors roared, and soon they were speeding down the runway, where they paused to wait for a signal from the tower. "Here we go," shouted Holly as they raced across the airstrip. Soon the plane rose into the air, and the Hollisters removed their seatbelts. "There's 3 Mile Corners," cried Holly, her nose pressed against the window pane. "And I can see the Parker house." Presently, the familiar landscape grew smaller and smaller as the plane gained altitude. Then big billowy clouds began drifting in between the plane and the earth. "The clouds look like whipped cream sitting in the sky," commented Ricky, pointing. "I think," said Holly, "they look like little lambs, sleeping in pretty blue beds." Before long there were no blue beds to be seen at all between the masses of clouds that had turned gray. The children were glad when, after a while, Miss Gilpin came to sit across the aisle from Pete and Ricky. Pam and Holly were just behind them. They told her about Zip and the missing poodle. Suddenly, Pete had an idea. The dog-napper's car was headed for the airport. Maybe he'd taken a plane. "Did you have a passenger last Friday with a white poodle?" he asked. The man would have been wearing a bright blue suit. Miss Gilpin looked startled. In a low voice, she said, "Friday evening, just as the plane I was in was about to take off, a man in a bright blue suit rushed up and got aboard at Shoreham. He almost missed the plane." "Was he carrying a dog?" Ricky asked excitedly. "No, but he did have a big box with holes cut in the top," the stewardess informed the children. "I wondered at the time if it might contain an animal. The man was a surly fellow, and his hand was bandaged." "It was," the Hollisters chorused. And Ricky said, "I'll bet the poodle bit him." "Did the man go all the way to Florida?" Pete asked. "I'm sure he got off the plane at Greenville. That's the midway stop on the way to Florida," Miss Gilpin told them. "Crickets!" exclaimed Pete. "That's a great clue." "Where did the bad man sit?" Holly asked. The stewardess pondered for a moment. Then she pointed to the very seat Ricky was occupying. "I'm certain it was seat 20 by the window, and I remember his name, too. It was Fred Smith." A buzzer rang, and Miss Gilpin went to answer a call from the pilot. Pete wished they were going to stop at Greenville long enough to hunt for the poodle. "Dad, don't you think we should let Officer Cal know this?" the boy asked. "You're assuming, of course," Mr. Hollister said, smiling, "that the plane passenger was the thief. We'd better go slow and not accuse anyone unjustly." Mrs. Hollister laughed. "You children have become such detectives that you think of everything. But I wouldn't count too heavily on finding the stolen poodle." At that moment there was a whoop from Ricky, who had been wiggling around in his seat. "Look, maybe this is a clue." He held up a crumpled piece of paper and waved it in front of Pete. Pete took the paper and read aloud as he smoothed the page. "Coming, The Great Wizard Circus, superb acrobatic acts, oriental magicians, trapeze artists, amazing tightrope performers, the world's finest trick dogs. Trick dogs, the boy repeated. That poodle was a trick dog. Go on, Pete, Holly urged. Pete read aloud again. See wild animals from the jungles. Elephants, lions, tigers. Don't miss this wonderful show. Yikes, I'd like to see it, Ricky exclaimed. Where's it coming to? Pam asked. Pete scanned the paper carefully. That's funny, he said. It doesn't say. Isn't that strange, Dad? Mr. Hollister glanced at the handbill. I think it's just a sample set up from a printer, Pete, he said. That wasn't all he was going to put on it. Ricky was disappointed and said so. But his father told him he would see plenty of wild animals at the Sunshine Circus where they were going. He advised that the children settle down and read for a while. Sue fell asleep immediately, lulled by the motion of the plane. 2 hours later, she awoke and said, Mommy, the plane feels like a rocking horse. It's awful bumpy. She was right. The big liner was bouncing up and down like a rubber ball, and the clouds now looked more like monstrous waves than gentle lambs. It grew darker and darker by the minute. The plane dipped and soared again as if it were trying to dodge the oncoming black clouds. Suddenly, a torrent of rain pelted against the windows. Miss Gilpin's quiet, reassuring voice was heard. The pilot says we should pass through the storm shortly, she informed them. But if not, we may go down at Greenville and wait for better flying weather. Pete nudged Ricky. Crickets, I hope we do. Then we can hunt for the stolen poodle.